From the top rope and the Great American Bash, I bid you all good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you may be in this great land of ours or around the world. Welcome to the $55 million studio on the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's get into this issue. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. October 19, 1998 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Pride 4 results. Brian Hildebrand diagnosed with inoperable cancer. More. By Observer staff. In what was the lead story in several sports newspapers the next morning in Japan, a pro wrestler scored one of the biggest upsets in the history of mixed martial arts, beating one of the myths of the sport on the Pride 4 show on October 11 at the Tokyo Dome. But it wasn't Nobuhiko Takada beating Rickson Gracie. Little-known indie wrestler Alexander Otsuka, 195-pounder from the Small Battlers organization, seemingly put in the ring to be a quick jobber for legendary Brazilian former UFC tournament champion Marco Ruas. Some 20 minutes later, made himself a major name when a very bloody and completely exhausted Ruas told his corner and the referee that he couldn't continue after the end of the second 10-minute round. He had been exhausted, was reportedly turning a shade of purple, and just hanging on and taking a real pounding for several minutes. After the match, Ruas, considered by Brazilians for years as the top luta livre-style fighter around, was literally crying in his corner when the realization set in that he had quit in a match for the first time in a nearly 2-decade-long fighting career. This was, while nowhere near as newsworthy, every bit as big an upset as when Buster Douglas beat Mike Tyson in the same building 9 years earlier. Gracie beat Takada again before an estimated crowd of 30,000, announced attendance was 36,354, but that was an inflated figure. Pro Takada fans and a live gate estimated in the $3 million range, which with the exception of New Japan and All Japan's shows in the same building would be the largest live gate of the year anywhere in the world for a house drawn by a pro wrestler since he was the draw on the show. Gracie had more trouble than the first time but still put away Takada with an armbar in 9:30. The match was 1 year to the day in the same building of their first meeting, which Gracie won in just 4:47 and which drew a crowd of about 36,000, although both crowds were somewhat papered. Kakutogi Revolution Spirits, KRS, the promoters, didn't announce a return date at the show, which started a lot of rumors that this would either be their last show or their last undertaking at an event of this magnitude. After the show, there were a lot of hints of a return show for February using Royce Gracie's long-awaited Japanese debut and his first pro fight in nearly 4 years as the main event. It was said to have been overall the best KRS show to date. Gracie vs. Takada was covered as the lead sports story on news reports, with video clips of the match appearing on 4 of the 5 networks. More than 200 reporters from around the world covered the match, which must be some sort of a record for MMA. There was expected to be a lot of pressure on Gracie to put Takada over, since it would make the most sense for business, both Vale Tudo and pro wrestling business, to create interest in a third meeting between the two. A win over Gracie in one night would not just salvage Takada's damaged reputation, but in one fell swoop make him the biggest pro wrestling star in Japan and a national hero. Obviously, in Gracie's world, pride means more than financial pressure, and you have to credit him for that pride, as selling out to the same pro wrestling that his father hated back in the 50s would not just be selling out his own reputation and art form, but the family reputation as well. Gracie claimed that despite rumors to the contrary, he has a match-by-match deal with KRS and is not under contract for any return appearances, nor did he publicly even hint at retirement after the show. Takada issued a challenge after the match for a third meeting, but Gracie turned it down, saying there was nothing left to prove. He's played this game well up to this point from a business standpoint, as he's the highest paid fighter in the game, commanding upwards of $250,000 per appearance while maintaining his integrity up to this point, in that he hasn't done any works or jobs yet. At the same time, he's also been able to maintain a mythical status while at the same time never getting into the ring with a top-class opponent, at least in the last 5 years since the NHB movement took off in the US and Japan. And yet, because of his name and reputation, and despite not having beaten anyone of significance in years, he is the person that all the top fighters challenge. Takada was thought to have no chance to win in a straight shoot, but was given a win in a worked match on the previous KRS show to help build up this showdown. If a finish could have been manipulated for him to win, Takada likely could have parlayed the win into perhaps another huge gate for a third meeting, and also for another run of stadium shows for New Japan and or other companies against the top pro stars, as he did in New Japan's record-setting 1995-96 season. New Japan was hoping for a Takada win, which again explains the business incentives that could have been there for Gracie to lose, including a probable January 4th Tokyo Dome main event slot against Shinya Hashimoto and perhaps another IWGP title reign, since New Japan still owes Takada a win over Hashimoto from a 1996 interpromotional deal. Takada did get some offense in, so his reputation as a shooter wasn't totally destroyed by the loss, as it was in the aftermath of the first match. Takada threw punches and knees at Gracie into the corner, took him down and got the mount on him and threw blows from the top. When Takada tried for a leg submission, Gracie was able to reverse and mount him and throw a series of punches to the stomach to soften him up for a quick position change into the armbar, and the ref immediately stopped the match. Because Takada got some offense in, the crowd at least had something to cheer about, and it was generally considered from a standpoint of the crowd of almost exclusively pro wrestling fans to be a good match and not another Takada funeral. Exactly what this means for Takada's pro wrestling future is unclear. The best fit for him at this point would seem to be working for the UFO promotion, Antonio Inoki's new group built around former MMA competitors to become the New Japan interpromotional rivals down the road. UFO has already signed up several fighters who had worked for the Kingdom Group, and its rules and product are expected to be similar as well, which Takada actually never worked for but had a loose affiliation with as the successor to Takada's own defunct UWFI office. Inoki is building that company largely around the colorless former judo champion Naoya Ogawa and desperately needs some people with box office marquee value. Even though Takada is past his prime as a pro wrestler as well, he was at one time one of the best workers in the business, had a believable style and a tremendous track record of drawing when given the right opponent that would fit into what UFO and Inoki are trying to get over. Perhaps UFO can give him some wins over its stable of former MMA stars and give him a feud with Don Fry, where to revitalize his career he'd need to get the first win that would somewhat rehabilitate his name, at least to the pro wrestling crowd. There's always All Japan, but the two sides never came close on money a few years back when a move to All Japan seemed to be the best for both sides, and All Japan has always been reluctant to put outsiders over its top stars and therefore would squander the long-term potential of the new matchups a new headliner from the outside would create. Hashimoto, who was in Tokyo for the New Japan Korakuen Hall show that was taking place at the same time at the building next door, left Korakuen Hall after his match for the Tokyo Dome and watched the final two matches on the show. The plan was for Hashimoto to challenge Takada should he win the match. As things turned out, Hashimoto offered a challenge to both Gracie and Takada to reporters after the show. And for the 27-year-old Otsuka, it's too early to tell. He may wind up just being a trivia item for the future as a pro wrestling Buster Douglas whose entire life can be summed up by his 15 minutes of fame. A 3-year pro, Otsuka has worked for numerous indies and done shoot matches in rings where he lost to their preliminary guys, so this upset is probably a lot more of an indication that Ruiz, who is said to be 38 but at probably close to 40, was either highly overrated to begin with or age has caught up with him, than Otsuka being a world beater. In that sense, over the long haul, this may mean no more than when Yoshiki Takahashi became the first Japanese to beat a named Brazilian under UFC rules when he beat Walid Ismail in 1997. It was a big deal at the time, but that was more of a measure at how MMA had evolved past the days of Brazilian being years ahead of the game and dominating, and of how far the top Japanese fighters, like the Americans, have improved in a very short period of time. It was not, as time has shown, that Takahashi didn't become a world beater or new superstar, as he lost his very next fight in Pancrase, and since that time he's remained as a mid-level fighter, and whatever popularity he gained from the win was short-lived. To show just how little of a chance it was thought Otsuka was going to have against Ruiz, whose only prior loss in MMA was via a decision to Oleg Toktarov at the first Ultimate, a loss he somewhat avenged in pounding Toktarov for 30 minutes in a return match in Brazil that was technically a draw due to having no judges, but where generally everyone conceded Ruiz clearly won. Unlike virtually all fighters who curtail outside activities and train specifically for their fight for the last several weeks, Otsuka was still not only working regularly as a pro wrestler but as recently as 6 days before the fight worked the Battle Arts Korakuen Hall show in the third match of a 7-match show, where he hardly took it easy despite having a real fight a few days away, doing moves like topes and a lot of dangerous brawling spots. In addition, that morning before the show, Otsuka was part of the ring crew, so he was doing physical work the very morning of his big fight. Otsuka wasn't even considered as one of the top stars in the Battle Arts promotion, as the main pushed guys have been Yuki Ishikawa, Minoru Tanaka and Daisuke Ikeda. In 1997, he was put over as the winner of the Battle Arts Young Generation Battle Tournament. Otsuka, whose real name is Takashi Otsuka, will be put in a tag match teaming with Muhammad Yone against the Road Warriors when the latter team returns to Japan after a several-year absence on the November 23 Battle Arts show at Sumo Hall. The original plan for Battle Arts was to put Daisuke Ikeda and Jinsei Shinzaki in as the tag team to face the WWF's LOD 2000, who were super drawing cards a decade ago in Japan and will mean something as an attraction for their return as a nostalgia act, just as Bob Backlund did at Korakuen Hall on October 5. Even though Otsuka was basically a mid-card guy with an independent-level promotion, for whatever reason, He did have some cult popularity for the past year or so with the Japanese gay community and had finished higher than you'd think in a magazine popularity poll of the Japanese wrestlers. In the days following the event, the Battle Arts promotion received tons of phone calls from fans all over the country to congratulate Otsuka for the win. In a press interview on October 13th, Otsuka, apparently recognizing his own limitations, said that he would never fight UFC style again. He said that he was a pro wrestler and felt he was representing the pro wrestling community and he just wanted to show that pro wrestlers could do it. He said he was interested in beating big-name pro wrestlers like the Road Warriors as opposed to martial arts fighters and that if Ruiz was interested in a rematch, it would have to be on a Battle Arts show. There appears to be a major promotional rivalry right now between KRS and Rings. Apparently Rings and Wawa had booked the Tokyo Dome on September 14th with the idea of headlining with a Rickson Gracie vs Akira Maeda match. However, Gracie instead signed with KRS for a return match with Takada, leaving Rings without a big show for this year. Rings, in retaliation, was able to make the deal with Alexander Karelin and made the announcement of it only a few days before this show to attempt to steal some of its thunder. It now appears KRS is going to plan a major show in February, which not so coincidentally is the same time the Maeda Karelin match is scheduled. The show also featured a retirement ceremony for pro wrestler Koji Kiao, who did one worked match in this promotion's initial show, and who ended his career as a pro wrestler a few months back. Best known as Fuchu Haguro, the youngest sumo grand champion ever, Kiao was then booted out of the sport for disciplinary reasons, and went on to become a major flop as a pro wrestler. They had been doing an angle where Shinobu Kandori, the current WWA and LLPW women's champion who was a world-ranked judo star in the 80s, was training with Kiao, who is 6'7" and 385 pounds, for her octagon cage match the previous night at Sumo Hall against 6'3", 330-pound 1988 Olympic judo medalist Svetlana Gundarenko of Russia. Gundarenko captured the 1,995 liters -1 tournament, a shoot tournament similar to the original UFC's, with women, beating Kandori in the finals, and this was their first rematch. On the women's octagon cage show, which drew an estimated crowd of 5,000, announced figure was 7,824, Kandori avenged the loss as Gundarenko, although it was not only a worked match, but a badly worked one at that. It was the only worked match on the L1 show. Gundarenko was said to have been larger and had less mobility than 3 years ago. The finish of the match was to a front guillotine choke in 4:08. In regards to what appeared to be shoot or work, the feeling from those there were that Kandori Gundarenko was the only worked match on either show. A complete Tokyo Dome show rundown. 1. Igor Vachenchin, 23-1, defeated much larger Gary Goodridge, 9-7, in 5:58 when the ref stopped the match. The match was all on its feet and somewhat slow until Vachenchin caught Goodridge in the corner and began pounding on him. 2. Akira Shoji, 3-1-3, defeated Valid Ismail, 7-2, in 11:26. Ismail was able to dominate early using wrestling techniques, but eventually tired and took a lot of hard shots before the ref stopped it. There were some who considered this a quick stoppage, although Ismail was out of gas. With this win, they are trying to set Shoji up for a rematch with Renzo Gracie, as the two had a 30-minute draw last year, and had there been judges, Shoji should have gotten the decision. 3. Shunsuke Matsui, 0-2, drew with Sanae Kikuta, 0-1-1, over 30 minutes. Matsui is a pro wrestler under Takada's banner. This match, according to most reports, was said to have put the crowd to sleep. 4. Kazushi Sakuraba, 3-0-1, drew with Alan Goes, 3-1-1, over 30 minutes. Sakuraba is another pro wrestler under Takada who is so highly respected as a shooter in MMA that he's ranked second in the world behind Frank Shamrock in the under 200-pound weight class by Fighting Sports News. We've heard a variety of live reports on this match. Apparently it was considered a good match among the hardcore fans because both are skilled guys, but the largely pro wrestling audience live considered it boring, and there were a lot of boos for the match, particularly when Goes would simply drop to his back to avoid stand-up confrontations. We've also heard a mixed bag when it comes to who would have won the fight had there been judges. There are reports of each man dominating the fight, and of it also being too close to call. Goes apparently scored some good takedowns, but Sakuraba defended him well. Others considered Goes laying on his back for several minutes and refusing to get up as a sign that Sakuraba would have had to have won a decision, claiming he was in control 75% of the match. Sakuraba was bleeding badly from the ear and also from the face, which Goes supporters would use as a reason to say that he won the fight. Goes was limping badly after the fight from repeated leg kicks. 5. Satoshi Honma 1-0 beat Yuhi Sano 0-2, in 9:25 when the ref stopped the fight. Sano is another pro wrestler under Takada, who's best known in pro wrestling for his series of 1990 classics when he feuded with Jushin Liger over the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title. Honma, about 200 pounds, with a karate background, was a strong fighter standing up, and gave Sano a real pounding before the ref stopped the match after strikes from the mount. 6. Otsuka. Takashi Otsuka 1-0 beat Ruiz 7-2-1, when Ruiz told his corner to throw in the towel after the end of the second round. This was generally considered as the best match on the show, and the crowd went nuts, as you could imagine, when the match was stopped. Ruiz had Otsuka in a rear naked choke just as the first round was ending, and it appeared Otsuka was saved by the bell. Ruiz, who had done more power training than ever before with the likes of Kerr, ran out of gas and took a lot of punishment in the second round. 7. Mark Kerr 10-0 defeated Hugo Duarte 5-2 22-32 when the ref stopped the match after Duarte had taken a real beating and left the ring. Kerr was just too powerful and dominated the fight, bloodying Duarte up badly. Duarte spent most of the match trying to protect his eye, which had a sliver cut, and didn't do much of anything on offense. After the match, Kerr challenged Gracie. Among the people in Kerr's corner for the fight were Boss Rutan and noted pro wrestling agent Barry Bloom. 8. Gracie 9-0 defeated Takada 0-2 in 9:30 with an armbar submission. WCW referee Brian Hildebrand, who has used the ring name of Mark Curtis since his start in the profession, was diagnosed with inoperable stomach cancer after he was opened up in surgery on September 7. Hildebrand, 36, was told by one doctor that he had 2 to 3 months left to live, while a second doctor put the estimated timeline at 6 months to 1 year. Earlier this year, Hildebrand had underwent not only surgery, but both radiation and chemotherapy treatments to combat stomach cancer, and had lost a lot of weight, dropping from his normal 140 pounds down to around 100. However, he was able to return to WCW and slowly got his weight back to the 135 range before the past few weeks, when his stomach turned on him once again and he was unable to keep any food down and suffered a drastic weight loss. Hildebrand believed it was due to a blockage in his stomach caused from scar tissue from the previous surgery, but when opened it was revealed the problem was the cancer had returned. Hildebrand had been a lifelong wrestling fan dating back to the old Ofia fan club convention days, whose dream was to be in the business, and had been among the closest friends of both the late Eddie Gilbert and Jim Cornette, starting when all three were teenagers and before any of them had gotten into the business as performers. Originally from Pittsburgh, he was trained by Dominic DeNucci alongside both Cactus Jack and Shane Douglas. He became something of a student of working, learning not only American style but some shoot moves, and because of his size was one of the few Americans outside of California to seriously train in lucha libre style. However, he came along at a time when his size was a limiting factor, and despite being a great bump taker, his wrestling was largely limited to gimmick roles in Ninja Turtle outfits. Because of his size, he focused on being local independent manager Dr. Mark Curtis, whose strengths were as a ringside performer, and did a gimmick that preceded and was similar to the one downtown Bruno, another Pittsburgh native, took to Memphis and got a break with. He came close to breaking in with a full-time circuit on a few occasions, largely when Gilbert was booking, and had one run in the Kansas City circuit end abruptly when Gilbert's stay ended before moving to Morristown, Tennessee, and becoming Cornette's right-hand man and main referee for the duration of Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Shortly after that promotion folded, he went to WCW as a referee and had gotten married earlier this year. But his greatest strengths were probably as a person and not as a performer, in what friends universally noted was his ability to maintain a clear perspective on life and on the wrestling business while wrapped up in a business that has anything but that clear perspective on either. He was someone whose dream was to work in the business, but was not blind to any of the realities of that business. Even today, his dealing with the hand that has been given him has only made him more motivated to reach a new goal of actually returning to work at WCW in about 2 months. Got a copy of Observer reader Herb Glossbrenner's new booklet on the history of the bench press? $32.95 US, $37.95 foreign at P.O. Box 65692, Los Angeles, California 90065, which is basically a listing of the top 200 bench pressers in every weight class in American history. There are only a few pro wrestlers who make the list, most of whom were more notable as lifters who tried pro wrestling as opposed to successful pro wrestlers, although Doug Furnace and Scott Norton are exceptions to the rule. However, what is interesting is in recording the history of the world's record in the bench press you see many names that did pro wrestling. The first recorded world record in the bench press was set by George Hockenschmidt, who certainly would go down as one of the best known pro wrestlers that ever lived for his recognition by many as the first real world heavyweight champion. his run as the top star in Europe and his 2 losses to Frank Gotch, which were largely responsible for Gotch becoming up to that time the biggest pro wrestling star ever, and even to this day he's one of the most legendary figures in pro wrestling history. In 1898, Hackenschmidt, who actually was lying on his back because they didn't have bench press benches in those days, rolled the bar weighing 362 pounds from behind his head across his face and pressed it, a record that stood for 18 years. In the early 50s, Doug Hepburn, a noted Canadian strongman who tried pro wrestling but was never a major star, destroyed previous marks by something like a 100-pound jump, eventually doing 560 pounds. That record was broken in the mid-50s by his American strongman counterpart, Paul Anderson, who also tried pro wrestling but was never a major star, who did 580 in 1957, and there are witnesses who claim he did 627 in his basement in 1958. All of these world records are basically theoretical, as the actual sport of powerlifting, where bench press is one of the 3 regulation lifts along with deadlifts and squats, didn't even exist until 1965. Ted Arcidi set the record when he became the first man in history ever to bench 700 pounds, 705.5 in 1985. After doing the lift, went into pro wrestling and had a brief run doing the strongest man in the world gimmick in the WWF Texas and for Stampede Wrestling. Like Anderson and Hepburn before him, he lacked agility and was a poor performer and was never a major star. Arcidi's record has long since been broken, and the current world record is 780 pounds. Mark Henry, who the WWF bills as the strongest man in the world, best mark is 525, although there is a whole lot more to overall strength than how much you can bench press, and in many ways when it comes to athletes it's very much an overrated measure of usable transferable strength when it comes to sports where power is a major factor like track, football and wrestling. Anyway, a brief look through the book noted a few pro wrestlers. In the 275-pound weight class, Furnace 600 in 1987 tied for 26th best of all time, while Tony Atlas 550 in 1987 ranks tied for 147th spot. In the super heavyweight division, Arcidi's 705 now ranks 8th, while Bill Kazmaier, who in his day was considered the strongest man overall in the world and was another who tried pro wrestling but wasn't any good at it and didn't last long, who can forget that classic run of Lex Luger versus Kazmaier WCW world title matches? Ranks 14th with 661 in a 1981 lift. Scott Norton's 640 in 1988 puts him in a tie for 22nd spot, and Harold Hogue's 600, Ice Train, who currently wrestles for CWA in Europe, in 1991 ranks him tied for 65th spot. There may be 1 or 2 others that I didn't notice. They also have things broken down into the best by the respective decade. For the 70s, Kazmaier's 534 ranked 8th, at 275, and his 617 ranked 2nd among super heavyweights. For the 80s, Arcidi's 650 ranked 2nd at 275, and Furnace 600 tied for 9th at 275. Arcidi's 705 ranked 2nd as a super heavyweight, Kazmaier's 661 ranked 4th, and Norton's 640 ranked 7th. Kyoko Hamaguchi, the 20-year-old daughter of Japanese wrestling star Animal Hamaguchi, Ego Hamaguchi, captured her 2nd consecutive World Freestyle Wrestling Championship on October 10 in Poznan, Poland in the 165-pound weight class. For the 2nd straight year, Hamaguchi defeated Christy Stingline of Albany, New York, this time by a 5-3 score, in the gold medal match to climax the 3-day tournament in the heaviest weight class competed for in women's freestyle. It was Stingline's 3rd consecutive 2nd-place finish at Worlds. Hamaguchi has been trained since childhood by her father, who has become almost a parody of a Little League parent, to follow in his footsteps as not only a pro wrestler, but also an amateur wrestler and a championship bodybuilder. She first gained a measure of television publicity at the age of 13, entering women's teenage bodybuilding contests due to the story hook of being the daughter of a television celebrity, as her father was not only a great worker for more than 2 decades, best known for his run in the early 80s as the tag team partner of Riki Choshu as they formed what was up to that point in time one of the great tag team combinations of all time, but also appeared regularly on Japanese afternoon game shows. She burst onto the national amateur wrestling scene in Japan at the age of 15, when she captured the Teenage National Championship at 143 pounds. Since that time she has captured the last 3 national overall championships, first at 154 pounds and the last 2 years at 165, and represented Japan in the last 4 world championships, placing 13th in the world as a 17-year-old in 1995 and 7th the next year before capturing titles the past 2 years. Animal Hamaguchi's basic plan for her, grooming her to eventually be the top pro women's wrestler in Japan, is to turn pro after the 2000 Olympics in Sydney, Australia, preferably already as a national hero with a gold medal in tow. In newspaper stories following her win, the stories quoted both Shinobu Kondori of LLPW and Kyoko Inoue of Neo Ladies as saying they were interested in signing Hamaguchi to be a top star in their respective promotions as soon as she was interested. Hamaguchi's first major exposure on the pro wrestling scene was at the age of 16, losing a shoot match under amateur rules by a 5-1 score against the overall world champion in her then 143-pound weight class. 23-year-old Doris Blind of France on the record-setting All Japan Women's Big Egg Wrestling Universe show at the Tokyo Dome on November 20, 1994, which drew 42,500 fans, although she had received some Wrestling World publicity for doing bodybuilding contests and training for that with her father, for a few years even before that. After the match, a somewhat embarrassed Hamaguchi, who was seconded by her father who came off as the prototypical Little League father at the show, was ordered by him to do his trademark most muscular poses to all four sides of the ring. If and when she becomes a full-time pro as expected, Hamaguchi would join still active Gran Hamada's two daughters Xochitl, who wrestles in Mexico for AAA, and 16-year-old Ayako, who wrestles for Urgent, as daughters of pro wrestlers from that era. Japanese television rundown. September 27, All Japan. 1. Misawa pinned Mossman in 7:34. Basically Mossman did everything until the finish. He looked good, but the problem was that nobody in the building thought he had a prayer of winning, so they didn't react to his offense except for one great reverse into a kick that they didn't see coming. When Misawa made comebacks, the people got into it as they popped for Mossman kicking out of a few near falls before Misawa put him away with the elbow. 2.5 stars. 2. Kawada pinned Kakihara in 6:52. This was an excellent match, particularly in meshing styles, but it had two drawbacks. It was too short, and because of that and the lack of a finishing move, nobody was ready for the finish, so it ended flat. They had great standing exchanges and beat the hell out of each other. They had a cool spot after Kawada dropped Kakihara on his head. He went behind him again for a German suplex, but Kakihara rolled it into an ankle lock. It turned into a UFC style with mounting and pounding from the top, and then Kawada got behind Kakihara and elbowed at the back of his head to loosen him for the choke. Kakihara got away, but standing, Kawada just destroyed him with palm blows and got the pin. This audience wasn't ready for palm strikes to be a finisher. 3.5 stars. Mexico. The main event on the October 9th Arena Mexico show had Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr. and Pierroth Jr. over Negro Casas and Elio del Santo at Atlantis in straight falls with a DQ in the second. Santo was all taped up to sell his injuries. The story of the match was that Santo was selling his back, which the heels worked over, and that Casas took a bad bump and was rendered useless. However, the faces made the big comeback in the second fall until Santo accidentally hit Casas with a tope when Scorpio moved. The heels began working on Santo again until Casas recovered and gave Salvaje a low blow for the DQ, although there were hints of the beginning of a Casas heel turn to continue his lifelong feud with Santo, although at present the two have turned out to be big drawing cards outside Mexico City as a tag team called Nuevo Pareja Atomica, New Atomic Pair. The original Atomic Pair was Gory Guerrero and El Santo in the 40s and 50s, and in the 90s Santo and Eddie Guerrero wrestled as the New Atomic Pair before Guerrero turned on him to form his tag team with Love Machine. October 16th has Felino and La Fiera and Casas vs. Fuerza Guerrera and El Satanico and Scorpio Jr. as the main event, and Atlantis and Lismark Sr. and Emilio Charles Jr. vs. Pierroth Jr. and Mascara Año 2000 and Gran Marcus Jr. as the semi. While Ricky Santana and El Boricua finished up this weekend, Headhunters are still around at least for 2 more weeks. After Cien Caras has pinned Rayo de Jalisco Jr. in trios matches the past 2 weeks at Arena Coliseo, they set up a match for Rayo's World Heavyweight title on October 13th. In kind of a surprise, the October 18th show at Arena Coliseo is headlined by a non-stip match with Casas vs. Blue Panther. Canek will appear at his first AAA TV taping on October 16th in Zacatecas. The original Mascara Sagrada received a letter from the commission allowing him to use that name on the October 24th Ocesa pay-per-view show. In DF court, Sagrada was ruled as being unable to use that name and that Antonio Pena had the right to give his version of Mascara Sagrada that name, but only in the Mexico City metro area. The October 13th Ovaciones had a column by Dr. Alfonso Morales really ripping on Conan, calling him Charles Asenoff, and saying he was born in the United States with a Russian father and a Cuban mother, says he's not Mexican, as if it was ever said he was in the first place except in WCW, and Morales called him a dog, self-serving and without any loyalty. El Sendero is back working with his original name of Astro Jr. Some more notes on AAA's Summer Scandal show, which drew 12,000 fans to Ciudad Madero on September 18. In the women's hair match, Alda Moreno attempted to hit Xochitl Hamada with a chair, but she moved and instead hit her sister Rosy Moreno, who was pinned and had her head shaved. Rosy was so mad she turned on Alda, and the two are now feuding, with Rosy going heel, teaming with Hamada and Miss Janeth as Las Brujas, while Alda has joined with Lady Discovery and Princesa Suje. All Japan. The two big shows of the week were October 11th in Nagoya and October 12th in Osaka. The Nagoya show had a strong lineup and drew 5,500 in the 9,000-seat gym. Osaka, in All Japan's first show at the new 8,000-seat Chuo Gymnasium, bombed, drawing only 1,500, although the lineup was weak. In Nagoya, Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taue retained the tag titles, beating Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama in 29:51 when Kawada pinned Akiyama with a jumping high kick to the face. The match aired later that evening on television and was said to have been a great match. The other top match was the first ever singles meeting, with Mitsuharu Misawa pinning Jinsei Shinzaki in 21:32 with a Tiger Driver. The top matches in Osaka saw Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa and Takao Mori over Kawada and Taue, and Masao Inoue and Gary Albright and Yoshihiro Takayama and Masahito Kakihara beat Kobashi and Akiyama and Kentaro Shiga. The latter three have been working a lot of trios main events as a group called Burning, with new black and white t-shirts. Top 5 matches at October 31st Budokan Hall are Kobashi vs Misawa for the Triple Crown, Kawada and Taue vs Takayama and Kakihara, Stan Hansen and Wolf Hockfield vs Albright and Giant Kimala 2, Akiyama and Shiga vs Ogawa and Satoru Asako and Giant Baba and Shinzaki and Masamichi Marufuji, a rookie in his first major career match, versus Geto and Jado and Yoshinobu Kanemaru. On the October 11th television show, Giant Baba said that on October 31st at Budokan Hall he'd announce who the new tag team partners for the tournament would be for Hansen and for Johnny Ace. The rumors going around are that Hansen's partner will be Vader and that Ace's partner would be Bart Gunn, since he knocked out Steve Williams, who was Ace's longtime partner, but we don't have any independent confirmation of either. They are doing an angle, which may or may not be based in reality, that Misawa's neck is really bothering him and he can't turn his head, which they are claiming is a result of taking suplexes on his head and hard lariats in the match last week in Niigata, where Kobashi pinned him in the trios match. This is of course to make people think Misawa may lose to Kobashi at Budokan. September 20th TV show did a 2.1 rating, while the September 27th show did a 3.5. New Japan. The NWO Typhoon Tour opened on October 9th in Koriyama for a sellout 3,800 fans, with the NWO team of NWO Sting and Keiji Muto and Bryan Adams winning on top over Shinya Hashimoto and Kensuke Sasaki and Tadao Yasuda, when Adams pinned Yasuda with an Oklahoma Stampede. Running Power Slam, the Yokohama Bay Stars baseball team won their league title, and at their victory party on October 8th, a lot of the players were wearing NWO t-shirts and a few players were wearing Hiroyoshi Tenzan masks. Two of the top players on the team, Naonori Suzuki and Daisuke Minowa, came out to ringside earlier this year at a Tokyo Dome show with Masahiro Chono. There were also photos in all the newspapers of Chono training both players for the new baseball season. New Japan drew a sellout 1,980 to Korakuen Hall on October 11th, which was impressive only because it took place at the same time as the Gracie Takada match next door. In the main event, Muto and Sting beat Sasaki and Kazuo Yamazaki in 15:47 when Muto used the armbar submission on Sasaki. While that was the same finish Gracie used to beat Takada, the New Japan match took place before the Gracie match did. However, the coincidence of using that finish wasn't a coincidence, as Muto used the move people were thinking about in their minds, because it was the way Gracie beat Takada last year. Antonio Inoki returned to Japan this week to help promote the UFO debut show on October 24th at Sumo Hall. Inoki claimed that Muhammad Ali was the co-owner of UFO and that Bill Clinton had personally sent him a telegram offering him support and congratulations on starting this new company to promote martial arts. Well, if you're going to lie, you might as well lie as big as possible. September 19th TV did a 2.6 rating and September 26th did a 2.3. Other Japan notes. On the L1 show on October 10th at Sumo Hall, a series of octagon cage matches, all of which were told were shoots except the main event, it saw Japanese women wrestlers win every match they were in. Becky Levi, who had an 85-pound weight advantage, beat Terry Lukomsky in 5:06. People were really impressed Lukomsky lasted as long as she did, being outweighed by so much. Others were amazed seeing Levi, who is 6'2" and 215 pounds, next to Svetlana Gundarenko, saying that Svetlana made Levi look tiny in comparison. As far as the Japanese pro wrestlers went, Yoko Takahashi of JD won her match in 154. Junkyo Yagi, a former national judo champ who works for LLPW, beat Floor Holman. Gerard Gordeau, student from Holland, in 8:28. Sorio Kino of LLPW beat Lee Dunja in 2 minutes when the corner threw in the towel. Yumiko Hata of AJW beat former ECW valet Angel Amoroso in 1:08 when the ref stopped the match as Hata had an armbar on, and JD's Linus Asuka beat Verhoof of Holland in 9:26 by a tap out for a key lock on the arm. There were complaints of disorganization and of no physicals being taken or blood tests before the matches since they were shooting. The Holland women were said to have no experience once they got on the ground but knew how to fight standing. Hata, when she took Amoroso down, picked her fist up like she would in a pro wrestling match, waiting for a crowd response before starting to throw punches. Some notes on Alexander Karelin, who makes his debut as a pro wrestler in February for Rings. While there is some debate regarding this label, Karelin is generally considered as the greatest amateur wrestler of all time due to his winning 11 consecutive world titles, which is a record. A clarification of Karelin's only known loss, which was a 3-2 loss in 1986 when he was 19 and facing the 29-year-old world champion. There are no official records of his career, so this figure, while given to me by reliable sources, is only an estimate, but the belief is his record is around 450-1. There is a Japanese amateur wrestler named Osamu Watanabe who had an international record of 186-0, and legend has it never lost a wrestling match on any level of competition, who is the other name people mention as the greatest of all time, but Watanabe retired after winning 3 world titles and 1 gold medal, so his time at the top wasn't as long. Rings ran another show in Gruzia of the former Soviet Empire on October 11th, headlined by Bitsaj Teriel of Gruzia against Hans Niemann. JWP has announced a press conference on October 15th where it is expected they will announce the retirement of Cutty Suzuki, Yumi Suzuki. Suzuki, who turns 29 on October 22nd, has been wrestling since the debut of the original JWP in 1986 when she was 16. In the early years, she gained a lot of popularity for her looks as opposed to her wrestling, and made a name for herself as a model, and in the early years was the top drawing card in the promotion. Later she graduated to nude picture books and softcore videos. She had wanted to retire last year, but the company convinced her to stay 1 more year due to the death of Plum Marco. It is believed that Suzuki, who had complained that she simply couldn't keep up the fast pace due to diminished stamina, will finish up with a retirement show in March and then move to Hawaii to try and learn fluent English. Michinoku Pro Wrestling will start its tag team tournament on October 24th, in which Great Sasuke and Sasuke the Great, who won't be Masao Orihara on this tour, will form a new tag team. The big November 1st show in Chiba has something of a weak lineup for a major show, with Great Sasuke, who last week was supposed to have been fired, and Sasuke the Great and Shima Nobunaga and Judo Suwa and Sumo Fuji versus Super Delphin and Grand Hamada and Grand Naniwa and Tiger Mask and Masato Yakashiji on top. There will also be a Royal Rumble, plus Jinsei Shinzaki and Takao Mori versus Tamon Honda and Jun Izumida from All Japan, and Naohiro Hoshikawa versus Kendo Kashin from New Japan. FMW announced for its November 20th pay-per-view show from Yokohama Bunka Gym that the top 2 matches would be Hayabusa defending their world title against Hiromichi Fuyuki, plus a lumberjack match with Atsushi Onita versus Mr. Pogo, and that Bam Bam Bigelow, Chris Condito and Tammy Lynn Sitch would be coming in from ECW. All Japan Women's TV show had a listing of the top 10 heels in the history of women's wrestling. In order, they were 1. Bull Nakano 2. Asia Kong 3. Devil Masami 4. Las Caceres Orientales, Atsuko Mita and Mima Shimoda and Akira Hokuto in their AJW heel days 5. Dump Matsumoto 6. Zaps 7. Eagle Sawai 8. Black Pair, Mami Kumano and Yumi Aikshida, who were the top heels in the late 70s, 9. Monster Ripper, Rhonda Singh, the top foreign heel in the late 70s and early 80s, who as a trivia note was not only Bertha Faye, who combined with bad booking killed the WWF's previous attempt at women's wrestling, but also was a high school classmate of Bret Hart's in Calgary, and 10. Jumbo Miyamoto, AJW's first native top heel, whose 5 WWWA title reigns from 1973 to 76 and 17 WWWA tag title reigns from 1971 to 1975, 9 of which were with Mariko Akagi, are still an all-time record. Anyway, to me, Matsumoto should be the clear number 1, as nobody ever got the heat she did, even though all those listed ahead of her were much better wrestlers. Asia Kong worked shows over the weekend for Gia, Kong will also have a singles match against Kyoko Inoue on October 20th to celebrate Inoue's 10-year anniversary of her pro debut. Inoue, 29, made her pro debut on October 10, 1988. Here and there. Jesse Ventura, 47, is listed in recent polls as being expected to garner 10 to 20% of the vote in the upcoming Minnesota gubernatorial election as a third-party candidate from the Pro-Reform Party. It's expected to be the best showing of a third-party candidate in the Minnesota governor's race since 1948, and some feel he could end up costing the Republican candidate the race because he'll siphon off votes from him. While many in his home state aren't taking him as a serious candidate, this week's Newsweek said he was up to 20% in the polls and was a dark horse to win the entire election. Now that's scary. But if it came down to Jesse the Body or Antonio Inoki for public office, I'd vote Jesse. Fox Network is planning its own version of a Secrets of Pro Wrestling type of show with the idea of running it before the November 1st date of NBC's planned special. Fox has still expressed interest in getting into the wrestling business, but any discussion in that direction remains in preliminary form. Mike Chapman's American Wrestling Museum in Newton, Iowa, which has wings for both amateur and pro wrestling, Luthez is basically in charge of the pro wrestling wing, which includes memorabilia dating back to the first Gotch Hackenschmidt match, drew about 2,500 people for its grand opening back on September 19th. The museum will play host to the Cauliflower Alley Club banquet on April 24th, which also happens to be Thez's 83rd birthday. Coco Ware, who has been out of action since suffering a stroke, resurfaced working an indie show in Houston on October 10th. October 10th in Memphis was built around a Jerry Lawler vs. Road Warrior Hawk TV street fight match. Both Hawk and Sid Vicious are being advertised on a number of area spot shows, so I guess the idea is for Hawk to work his way back in shape here. The October 3rd TV show did a whopping 10 rating locally. They announced a handicap match on TV with Brandon Baxter and Stacy vs. Randy Hales. Baxter told Stacy that Hales was completely nuts and asked her not to do the match. Stacy said no way because she wanted a piece of him. Vicious, after winning his 4 matches on the October 3rd Mid-South Coliseum show, which drew only 600 fans after topping 2,000 on the 2 previous shows, by virtue of the deal signed a contract with Power Pro, but in it were stipulations that he'd forfeit $50,000 in Monopoly money if he ever physically attacked Hales, and that he needed to get 5 counts and not 3 counts to win his matches. Sid said he agreed to the terms because he thrives on adversity. Lawler and Hawk ended in a no contest when everyone on the card ended up running in. The Border Patrol regained the NWA Tag Team titles, beating Barry Windham and Tully Blanchard on October 10th in Cameron, North Carolina before 240 fans for NWA All-Star Wrestling. Apparently this was done because of the belief that Windham and or Blanchard wouldn't be available much longer because one or both are WCW bound. We are looking for a listing of all the pro wrestling radio shows in the US for a book that Bert Sugar is doing on pro wrestling that Lou Albano will be ghostwriting. If you know of one in your city or are involved with one, please let us know. The E! Network did a feature on pro wrestling this past week, largely revolving around, get this, whether pro wrestling was real or fake. They had interviews with Vader, Bischoff and Goldberg and clips of Austin. Christian Cage of the WWF beat Julio Sanchez to win the Pennsylvania Championship Wrestling title before 512 fans on October 10th in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. Also on the show from the WWF were Bart Gunn, Too Cold Scorpio, and Andrew Martin. 2 interesting names on the Global Wrestling Alliance show on October 10th in Delaware, Ohio. Quick Kick Lee, which of course was taken from Akira Maeda's ring name in the early 80s when he was European heavyweight champion, and billed as the younger brother or cousin or whatever of the legendary Sammy Lee, Satoru Sayama's ring name in England, and Carl Cox, which is the name Herb Gerwig used, Killer Carl Cox, who was a major star mainly in the Southwest for 2 decades. Ottowan's Catch Wrestling Association has just about all new champions crowned on Champions Night on October 10th in Hanover, which was the final day of the recent Hanover tour. Heavyweight champ Marshall Duke Dries, and Intercontinental champion David Finlay were both not on the tour. They didn't have a heavyweight title match, but had Robbie Brookside beat Cannonball Grizzly via court to become IC champ. Junior heavyweight champion Michael Kovac was wrestling for WWA in Vienna, and Wands didn't book him because he worked as a jobber for ECW, like that has anything to do with anything. Kovac was actually in Hanover but not used, and Karsten Krestmar won the vacant title beating Bounty Hunter. Ulf Herman and Christian Eckstein held the tag titles, but Herman is in the US, so they would up having Rhino Richards and Joe Legend, 2 Michigan area indie guys, won the vacant CWA tag titles beating August Smile, best known in the US for his pay-per-view match with Masakatsu Funaki, and Rico de Cuba, former EMLL wrestler Tony Rico. They also created a CWA shoot fight title where Tony St. Clair beat Franz Schumann to become the first champion. Of course this was not a shoot, nor was it even worked like a shoot because they bounced off the ropes and brawled pro wrestling style outside the ring. The other recognized champions that didn't defend on He card were St. Clair as Commonwealth champ and Schumann as middleweight champ. Long Island Wrestling Federation ran a Junkyard Dog Memorial show on October 10th at the Elks Lodge in Queens. Same building ECW runs and drew 600 fans, or roughly the same as ECW did in the same building for its last show, using Tito Santana, Demolition Axe, King Kong Bundy, George Steele, Jimmy Snuka and Johnny Valiant as the headliners. Several ECW wrestlers including a main event of Sabu beating Chris Condito worked for Axelrodden's Maryland Championship Wrestling on October 11th in Baltimore. The show drew about 750 fans, down from the usual 1,000 plus they had been doing at the building. Also on the show were Spike Dudley, Supernova and Blue Meanie and managers Jeff Jones, Chastity, Tammy Linsich and Bill Alfonso along with Tom Brandy and Stevie Richards. Complete NWA 50th anniversary show lineup on October 24th in Cherry Hill, New Jersey is Dan Severn defending NWA title against Steven Regal, a four corners match for NWA tag titles with Wyndham and Blanchard, Border Patrol, Kit Carson and Chris Germany from Texas and Eric Spraxia and Knuckles Nelson from NWA New England. North American MCW version, tag title with Stephen Dunn and Reno Riggins defending against Headbangers, Canadian heavyweight title with Mr. Gillis, Easy Rider and Mike Roselli, Cage with NWA vs. Hot Stuff International NWA 2000 tag title, with Harley Lewis and Twiggy Ramirez defending against Ace Darling and Devon Storm. TNT, from Danny Davis's Ohio group, and Tarzan Boy, the former Promo Azteca star now under contract to WWF, vs. Patch, Northeast Indy, and Danny Dominion, Wisconsin, Abdullah the Butcher vs. T. Rancholo, Lord Psych, New York, vs. Primo Carnera 3, Northeast, and WWF Battle Royal with Giant Silva, Glenn Kulka, Christopher Daniels, Tom Pritchard, Barry Houston, Andrew Martin, Tiger Ali Singh, Babu, Pablo Marquez, Steve Williams and Kurt Angle. It'll be Williams' first match back since tearing his hamstring and buttocks in the Brawl for All match with Bart Gunn. November 1st in DuQuoin, Eel at the Fairgrounds will have Disciple versus a surprise opponent from the NWO Black and White. Won't those fans have a nice surprise when it's Vincent, plus Nasty Boys? I think it's actually only Brian Knobbs because Sags isn't wrestling due to the lawsuit against WCW. Kevin Nash and Scott Hall claiming injuries have ended his career, but they are billing it as a plural, Greg Valentine Bushwhackers, Tatanka, and Honky Tonk Man. Eddie and Hector Guerrero will be working for George South's PWF on October 16th in Sumter, South Carolina at the Optimist Youth Center. Former wrestler Ken Dunlop of Australia suffered a mild heart attack at the age of 37. Speaking of Australia, on October 11th in Melbourne, Australia on the card was 62-year-old former WWF star of the late 60s, Mario Milano, who later became a top draw in Australia. Tommy Fierro has a show on November 6th in Paterson, New Jersey at the Catholic High School Gym with Bart Gunn vs. Darren Drozdov and Too Cold Scorpio vs. Doug Gilbert plus Devon Storm, Ace Darling, Luna Vachon, and Iron Sheik, plus November 18th in Iselin, New Jersey at the UFW Hall with Iron Sheik, Blue Meanie, Supernova, Reckless Youth, Storm Corino, and Misfits. For more info you can call 973-684-3137. Dale Gagner of the American Wrestling Association is looking for talent for upcoming shows. Interested parties should forward a bio, photos and phone number to Gagner at 4739 14th Avenue Northwest No. 4, Rochester, Minnesota 55901-8208 or call 507-281-8842. MMA. The talk now is that the follow-up to this week's UFC show will be in January, probably in Louisiana, although they're going to shortly make an effort at being sanctioned in Nevada. The October 16th show will be available in about 7 million pay-per-view homes, or about 20% of the total pay-per-view universe, which realistically means the show will do between 20,000 and 30,000 buys. There is no way, even with the scaled-down budget, that the show can make out financially with those kind of numbers, so it appears that Bob Merowitz's battle plan is to continue to fund a low-budget show until a cable break falls his way. Boss Rutan talked about appearing on the next show. Next K1 is October 28th at Tokyo Yoyogi Gym with Stan the Man Longinidis vs. Tsuyoshi Nakasako, the main event. Stan the Man was a big-name star years back but has pretty much retired, so it's probably an attempt to make a name for Nakasako by beating a big-name foreigner, as K1 is almost desperately trying to create a new Japanese star. The theme of the card is Japan versus the world, which includes Japanese fighting Andy Hug and former pro wrestler and extreme fighter Bart Vale, who must be near 50 by now, will also fight on the show, which is probably to give a Japanese star a win over a name. Nick Sanzo, a former UFC guy who lost to Jerry Bollander in a middleweight tournament final rather easily, also fights a Japanese fighter on the show, while Mike Bernardo faces a Thai fighter. I was at a Strikeforce ESPN2 taping on October 10th in San Jose. Kung Le, the star of the Draka shows, was the headliner doing a Chinese boxing rules match, which is basically the same thing as Draka, Sancho and shoot boxing. There are slight rule differences in all of them, but basically they all combine kickboxing tactics with wrestling takedowns, and he did a German suplex and 2 scissors takedowns, which aren't exactly what you expect to see on a shoot card. ESPN1 replayed the 1997 K1 Grand Prix tournament finals on October 10th. They showed it with the original announcing, thus there was no mention of K1 coming to the US, that K1 has come to the US, or of any future plans for K1 in the US. ECW. The October 10th show at the ECW Arena, which was expected to shoot some major angles for the pay-per-view show, was said to be a real good show but without many surprises. The show drew a sellout of about 1,600 and was said to have been the first show in a long time where they actually had to turn people away at the door. Danny During beat Chris Chetty. Wild Bill Wilds is doing a heel timekeeper gimmick, and as Chetty had the match won, he rang the bell only 5 minutes and claimed that the 30 minutes time limit had expired. It was meant as a knock on the time limit draws for the TV title on Nitros that go 6 minutes. During wound up winning. Tommy Rogers beat Little Guido. Chris Condito beat Jerry Lynn in a good match, which included a spot where they did a bulldog off the apron through a table. Lance Storm hit the ring and aimed for Condito but ended up hitting Lynn with the weakest looking chair shot, which pretty much killed the deal since it was the finish. Mikey Whipwreck came in for a run-in to clean house. Lynn challenged Storm to a pay-per-view match. Somehow in all this, Tammy Sytch gave Whipwreck the Stone Cold Stunner, and it wound up with both Sytch and Whipwreck as the refs for the pay-per-view match, probably building to 3 ways involving Whipwreck after the pay-per-view. Balls Mahoney went to a no contest with Masato Tanaka when the Dudleys attacked both guys. This led to a tag match with Tanaka and Mahoney beating Dudleys. The latter match was said to have been the best match at the ECW Arena in a long time, and the entire 2-match sequence was said to be the highlight of the show and was so hot that even had the rest of the show been bad, it would have been a good show just for that. Rob Van Dam beat Storm to keep the TV title. The Tommy Dreamer vs. Justin Credible match wound up with half the world interfering and ending up with Spike Dudley pinning one-man gang after an acid drop. New Jack did another balcony dive through a table in that brawl. The main event was Bam Bam Bigelow vs. Sabu, which was somewhat anticlimactic after the 4 previous bouts. The idea of the finish was that Bigelow was to have Sabu in the air. Van Dam clipped Bigelow's leg, but in doing so he dropped Sabu in his greetings from Asbury Park, similar to a Michinoku Driver 2, and got the pin. Shane Douglas, Condito, and the Dudleys all attacked Sabu and Van Dam afterwards until Taz made the big save. Raven was backstage at the show, but don't read anything much into that. The other show of the week was October 9th in Blackwood, New Jersey before 750 fans, which was said to have been just another show. TV this past week aired Credible vs. Mahoney and Tanaka vs. Bubba Ray Dudley from Dalton, Georgia. First match was okay. Mahoney's work has really improved. It's pretty impressive him doing splashes off the top, considering the pounding a guy of that weight takes on the knees doing that move. We have a correction in results from last week, as Tanaka actually beat Dudley after Sabu and Van Dam put Dudley through a table amidst a ton of run-ins. Dudley sold great for Tanaka, and the bout had great heat once they did the same brain cell killing chair shot Tanaka takes in every match, as it's the only way they've figured out to get fans get behind him. There is a big controversy regarding the PWI Top 500 and not ranking Supernova, which according to the folks at PWI is the biggest controversy in the history of their annual rankings. It's amazing people take that seriously, since most serious fans have always taken those rankings more as comedy, but every year not only fans but even wrestlers who should know better really do get upset, and egos of wrestlers really do get inflated based on their rankings. Doing a fair top 500 is impossible. That isn't to say one couldn't do a better job than was done, because a lot of people would have. I haven't tried listing 500 guys, but I'd assume if I did, Nova would easily make the cut. And based on the guys I've seen that are on the list, Nova is better than tons of them, and probably just about all that are rated below 300, including a few guys on the list that I'm not even sure exist anymore, and some that can't even lace boots. But his oversight was completely minor as compared to so many others that to take the list seriously and complain about that one is also a joke. The single best worked pro wrestling match I've seen this year was Kiyoshi Tamura vs Tsuyoshi Kosaka, and neither is in the top 500. Tamura is definitely one of the 10 best and maybe the single best worker in the world right now, but is penalized because they don't know how to handle his promotion, so they pretend it doesn't exist. Forgetting about oversights of Japanese and Mexicans that could be understandable, how about Don Frye, an American who admittedly isn't a good worker but he beats the hell out of Dan Severn from a work and charisma standpoint, is a major star in Japan to the point he worked the main event on the largest gate in the history of this entire business just a few months ago. I mean, how can you even take it as anything but comedy, something that lists Booker T, DDP, Ken Shamrock and Chris Jericho by any standard in the top 10 in the world? I can't think of a standard where Booker would make it, and I've been behind WCW giving him a bigger push this year. DDP based on his push, sure, but even on push he's not top 10, and in ability he's nowhere close. Shamrock, sure, if these rankings were based on who would win matches, if it was real, he'd be top 10 and probably number 1, but that's a whole different ball game. Jericho, if it's based on who does the funniest interviews, he'd be top 3, but for push he's not close, and for work he may be top 30 but not top 10. How about Sting, Tatsumi Fujinami, Owen Hart and Randy Savage in the top 20? Maybe if it was 1988, but in 1998? Or Rob Van Dam at number 14? Or Reckless Youth, Jeff Jarrett, Sabu, Hayabusa, Fit Finlay, Chris Condito and Dan Severn ahead of Shinya Hashimoto by any standard of pro wrestling illogic. Spike Dudley, Matt Hyson, is planning on opening a wrestling school in Live Oak, Florida, which is near Jacksonville, and running weekly Tuesday night shows in the town's 1,800-seat building. For area wrestlers interested in working the shows, you can call 912-368-6760. WCW. This week's news on pro wrestling's next major tragedy waiting to happen involves 2 internet letters posted by Dana Hall, Scott's ex-wife, on a website called NWO Central, which is not in any way affiliated with WCW. She asked why WCW continues to use Scott Hall as an active wrestler despite him clearly breaking company policies which are listed in his contract as breaches, and then taking every opportunity to exploit and humiliate his very real sickness as entertainment. She stated that while Hall is only acting out his addiction problems on TV, in real life there have been many times in the past he was under the influence and WCW allowed him to perform, and said now they have decided to exploit his very real problem with his addiction to drugs and alcohol as a means of entertainment of the fans for profit and ratings, only to stand by and watch him destroy himself. This is certainly one of the more tasteless angles done in many years, but this is also a business for the most part without heart or conscience, and a fan base that for the most part sees performers as their fantasy monkeys to jump through hoops and entertain them, and not as human beings. Dana Hall did go a bit far by putting up on the site photos of Scott with his children. The kids are estranged from their father due to the nature of the breakup, and worse, a police mugshot photo of Scott from one of his recent arrests. The end result is that, days after this, suddenly the website disappeared with nothing but a note from the guy running it that he doesn't want to talk about it. Obviously somebody is afraid of something, just a question of who and what. Nitro on October 12 from the United Center in Chicago drew a sellout 17,470, 16,439, paying $423,508. The crowd for the most part was really hot and made an overall bad show seem passable, and even good in spots. The first hour was almost excruciating, in that it consisted of 47 videos of Goldberg vs. Page and Hogan vs. Warrior. The first hour consisted of 2 matches totaling 5 minutes, 2 interviews and a million videos. Wrath beat Lodi with a meltdown in 101, after which Ming came out and he and Wrath brawled into the crowd. Poor Dale Torborg in his Nitro debut not only got booed out of the building playing babyface against Kendall Windham, but looked terrible and then blew out his knee doing his high kick finish in 420. Torborg came out wearing a race driver pit crew outfit which might as well have had the words jobber written on them. Even if he was good, which he wasn't, the fans would have shit all over him just because of the terrible ring outfit. Fans were chanting boring and they piped in all kinds of fake-sounding crowd noise. Mike Tenay mentioned Torborg as the son of former Major League Baseball player and manager Jeff Torborg, and that Dale had been a minor league ball player who quit to join the power plant, and praised him as one of the best wrestlers to come out of the power plant. That's a recommendation that facility certainly didn't need. Somebody needs to explain how WCW takes these guys and trains them for years at the power plant and almost none of them come out able to work a lick, and WWF has Dory Funk and Tom Pritchard train guys for a weekend while they don't come out as great workers. They at least can work and many of them show potential to be stars. Sting challenged Hogan and Hart. Warrior came out and was booed out of the place, and asked Sting to let him be his partner in a tag match. People were booing this and Sting never even accepted before the segment ended, but they just pretended that he did. Hogan and Bischoff came out to agree to the match. It was weird since Hart was going to be Hogan's partner, but it was Giant who came out with Hogan for the interview. Alex Wright pinned David Finlay in 158 when Wright had his feet on the ropes for leverage. Wright did an interview saying that Finlay was responsible for ending the career of his father Stephen Wright, who by the way was one hell of a great technical wrestler in the 70s and early 80s. The announcers hadn't been told of this and had no clue. Chavo Guerrero Jr. and Psicosis and Supercalo beat La Parca and Cyclope and Villano V in 528. Very fast-paced high-flying match. Unwieldy in spots, but great in other spots. Eddie Guerrero came out before the finish and it was obvious it was the sign to go home as they went to the finish where Chavo pinned Cyclope with a swinging DDT. Eddie got a surprisingly huge babyface reaction coming out with Hector Garza, Damien and Dandy and their LWO shirts. The Chicago crowd was WWF-like in that even the bad angles, if given TV exposure, become part of the show and the people come to see the guys who they consider as part of the show whether they are any good or not. Similar to Scott Steiner getting a big pop for doing an interview, and God only knows his interviews, while he's improving, are still not exactly the highlight of any show. He cut his best promo to date basically saying that Eric Bischoff took advantage of the economical situation and talked about the previous match saying nobody in the NWO could wrestle a match like that. He said it showed that Bischoff only puts the Mexicans against each other to hold them down. That line would actually make sense if the Mexicans actually got to win unless they were against each other, and that when they are wrestling each other in six-mans, that is the only time they're allowed to shine in the first place. Even though Chavo got the pin, it was Psicosis who got the shirt. It was a great visual with Eddie talking about how these guys put their lives on the line, and you never see guys in the NWO wrestling like that, while Psicosis was selling his back, total sell job, after doing the senton from the top rope to the floor. Scott Steiner did an interview running down Judy Bagwell. Judy and Marcus came out. Judy clearly has gotten carried away with her TV stardom as she had a makeover and a new look. Bagwell could have been an awesome face if it had been done right, but that's just another angle blown. He did well carrying the interview, challenged human bicep, ending when Scott gave him a low blow and dropped him throat first on the top rope. The throat drop should have gotten super heat considering Bagwell's injury, but it got no heat at all because by this time nobody actually believes Bagwell was even hurt in the first place. Judy did the angle no favors by laughing right into the camera as Marcus was doing a great sell job. That's the risks you take when you let Nitro become amateur hour. Sometimes you get lucky like last week with Mrs. B, but they'll probably bring her back every week to the point people will want Goldberg to spear her too. Juventud Guerrera, who was booed, pinned Prince Iaukea, who got no reaction, in 4 minutes. Disco Inferno interfered at one point and Billy Kidman chased him away. The interference didn't help the match and more detracted from it. Kevin Nash challenged Hall to a match. Hall showed up and ran. Nash ran after him. Major rule of thumb in pro wrestling: don't ever show a guy, particularly a face, running to chase someone when they can't run. Nash, who has bad knees from multiple operations over the years, ran so slow and unathletic which made him look like a big clod, then stopped running. Chris Jericho beat Raven with the Lion Tamer in 340 to keep the TV title. Both worked hard. They seem to be doing some sort of a losing streak gimmick for Raven, and may even be starting a face turn. In the high point of the show, Gene Okerlund interviewed Rick Steiner, who had a verbal duel with the puppet Chucky from the Child's Play series of movies. Poor Steiner having to be put in a position to challenge a puppet to fight. Fans hated this segment with a passion. Throughout the show they had teased a Bischoff/Flair confrontation. Early in the show, Bischoff told security and everyone to keep the Horsemen out of the building. They showed up with Bruce MacArthur, a lifelong friend of Flair's, who is a member of the Wirtz family that owns the Black Hawks, and is part owner of the building. MacArthur had security step aside. Some of them didn't seem it on the angle and they actually tried to stop him as they went in the building. Bischoff was totally overacting to the point he made McMahon seem like an Oscar winner threatening to sue everyone. At this point he came back out and said he was going into MacArthur's luxury box. They showed Flair and company partying with women throughout the show to kick Flair out. He went to the box. MacArthur, who did a real good job, but I hope that doesn't mean they'll try and make him a regular weekly character, told Bischoff to leave. Bischoff shoved MacArthur and a zillion security guards carried him out and eventually threw him in a police car and took him away. This segment of him being carried out took way too long, but it made for good TV. At least that's what I thought when I saw it a few months back on Raw. Now to the generation gap problem. The Flair character to get over even though he's old has to be the coolest old guy around, and sometimes he is. But sometimes, he's just a social old guy. The segments of the party reminded me of those kind of parties your parents go to where they get all dressed up and you wouldn't be caught dead at them even though they probably hit the right buttons with the 40-something crowd. I presume that me being older than the median age of a WCW TV wrestling fan, I'm not alone in that perspective of it. Between the announcers, wrestlers and execs on camera contrasted with the same with WWF, WCW does seem more and more like the older guys wrestling company even though it still has the best of the young talent. Goldberg beat Giant via countout in 2:45 of what was announced as a no DQ match. Goldberg got a giant pop, as the crowd was already going nuts over Flair coming out of the box and playing to them. Mike Tenay said he was 149-0, which is a made-up number because for whatever reason, they wanted this to be the night he won number 150. Stevie Ray came out and hit Goldberg with a chair and he no-sold it. However, he turned around into Giant's choke slam. Page ran in to save him from being pinned and hit the diamond cutter on Ray. Giant then picked Page up for the choke slam, but before he could put him down, Goldberg speared him. Giant simply left the ring while Goldberg and Page stared down. They had been advertising a 6-man tag with Hall and Ray and Norton versus Nash and Lex Luger and Khan on the entire show, but explained that it wasn't going to happen because Hall and Nash were gone. Why the other 4 couldn't wrestle wasn't explained. The actual plan originally was to make it a tag, but because the Bischoff segment where he was taken out went so long, they decided to cancel the match. Just as well as they couldn't figure out a finish since Bischoff didn't want Norton doing the job for New Japan Business Relations since he's IWGP champ, they don't want Ray doing many jobs whether it be for the Bobby Walker deal or other reasons, and they were already doing basic run-in DQ finishes for the other 2 big matches on the show. That wouldn't stop the WWF from doing the same finish 14 times in one taping. Finally, Sting and Warrior beat Hogan and Hart by a DQ in 5:39. Same old, same old. Actually, Hart and Sting were good. Warrior wouldn't even take off his jacket due to his torn bicep. He hot tagged in, go figure. Warrior was heavily cheered in this match, threw 3 clotheslines when Vincent, Scott Steiner, Norton, Ray and Giant all ran in. It looked like they were going to save Hogan, but really it was a voice from the dressing room that told them that Warrior could cut them a great deal on creatine, and they ran as fast as they could, being that all WCW athletes have to go through a stringent drug testing program and maintaining those physiques isn't easy. But it was a trick. Warrior nerve gassed all of them. For whatever reason, they didn't sell the nerve gas. So Sting came out with 2 baseball bats to clean house while Warrior was laying on the floor trying to catch his breath after all that exertion. With the new series Mortal Kombat airing after wrestling, it appears they no longer have the luxury of going past 11 p.m., which gives Titan a few free minutes to shoot its big angle every week before a huge audience. Nothing new was announced for the Havoc show. Ratings were delayed until after deadline this week due to Columbus Day. Even though Raw was the better show, I'd guess it was close or even a Nitro win because of the star power in the last 30 minutes of the show. If not, then Warrior is even deader than I thought, because as dead as he is, you'd think there would be curiosity of seeing him wrestle, if that's the correct term, for the first time in years on television. Roddy Piper stars in a TNT movie called Hard Times, which airs on December 13th. Villano Quattro had surgery on his neck on October 9th and had to stay in Atlanta this entire week before he could fly home. No word on long-term prognosis. Most of the Mexican wrestlers missed the TV taping in Gainesville, Georgia on October 6th because their individual contract discussions with J.J. Dillon, yes, that's really his role, took longer than expected, and I guess nobody from WCW thought to call Arn Anderson at the building to tell him the guys would be late, so he was blowing a fuse waiting for them to arrive. Damien, Super Colo, both Villanos, Dandy, Silver King, La Parca, Norman Smiley, Garza and Psicosis all signed 2-year extensions to their contracts that had 8 months remaining. All received raises, with the lower-ranked guys being moved up to about $95,000 per and the middle-ranked guys being bumped from $140,000 to $180,000. Juventud Guerrera hasn't signed as he's asking for $250,000 while WCW has offered him $180,000. The plan for the October 5th Nitro by suggestion of Hall was when Nash found him, he'd be drinking with Barry Windham. Bischoff didn't want to use Windham because he wasn't sure he'd gotten a release from Titan that would allow him to work WCW. Windham brought a lengthy Titan release, but Bischoff didn't have time to have it examined before the show. There seems to be a lot of movement to have Windham replace McMichael in the Horsemen. Of course McMichael doesn't fit, but Windham is yesterday's news. Rey Mysterio Jr. is expected to return at the October 19th Nitro. Havoc is already sold out. Thunder on October 8 in Indianapolis drew 11,315 to Market Square Arena, just shy of capacity, with 10,496 paying $271,495. The show drew a 3.68 rating and 5.85 share on the live show and a 1.2 rating and 4.2 share on the replay. Nondescript show except for some good comedy. Tony Schiavone said that 10A was on location with Hall at a bar about 40 miles away. Hall then cut the promo acting like he was drunk and mentioned Nash knew the place because they used to hang out there because it was right down the street from Market Square Arena. A limo supposedly containing Nash peeled out of the parking lot. Nash wasn't even at the show to begin with. Schiavone came back and again talked about how the bar was 40 miles away. Canyon beat Prince Iaukea with a flatliner in 5:18. Some sloppiness near the end, but both worked hard and did a lot of good stuff. Scott Steiner and Bagwell got into an argument when Scott started ripping on Judy and Marcus stuck up for Mom. Bagwell got over really strong in his verbal comebacks. Meng beat Jerry Flynn with the Tongan death grip in 142. Chris Adams came to the ring for his next match and Meng destroyed him. Wrath came out and started brawling. Wrath gave Meng this horrid-looking hesitation chair shot. He held the chair forever waiting for Meng to get his back in position to take it. Wrath must have had a major flashback to his legendary match against Sid Vicious. Horsemen showed up but Bischoff had gotten a restraining order not allowing any of them in the building except Malenko. They allowed Malenko in, but he wouldn't come in, saying that they were sticking together as a group. Which makes for an even funnier segment later in the show. Dandy vs. Tokyo Magnum ended with no decision in 1:30 when Scott Norton showed up and power-bombed both guys. Eddie Guerrero came out and told Dandy that Bischoff had sent Norton out because he doesn't want the guys getting over. Magnum wanted to join and Eddie shoved him away because he wasn't Latin. That was kind of funny. The only problem is it took Eddie forever to recruit Dandy. Interview was good otherwise. Perry Saturn beat Scott Putski with the Death Valley Driver in 5:15. Both worked hard but the people had confused that saying Saturn always says. They were thinking the saying was you guys work hard but it don't matter. Disciple did the funniest interview of the year. He tried to be a face but nobody cheered him. He let people in on this big secret. Hogan gets guys who have no business in the company jobs because they are his friends. He mentioned he wasn't one of them, because as we all know, he was a big star without anyone's help. When was that? But he pointed out Hogan's nephew Horace Boulder and challenged him. After that great mic work, you could have heard a pin drop. Disciple got the pin with the world's slowest stunner in 1:46. Horace jumped him after the match. Hold off your votes for Feud of the Year. Malenko came in, by himself. Didn't he say he wasn't coming in unless they came as a group? And sat down on a chair until they brought him an opponent. Barbarian came out and Bischoff told Barbarian he'd double his salary if he hurt Malenko. Malenko won with the cloverleaf in 2:35. Raven cut a promo on DDP. DDP came out and banged him in 5:17. Something about that doesn't read right. Overall a real good segment. That almost made up for the main event of Luger vs. Ray. All ran in and attacked Luger. The storyline was that he wasn't drunk after all and it was all a swerve. Nobody explained why 10A never came back if Hall could make it back and we were forced to endure 2 hours of Lee Marshall. Now that wasn't a DQ even though both guys were stomping the hell out of Luger. Ray then hit Luger with a slapjack. That was a DQ. Conan made the save but Hall destroyed him as well. In the building, fans started to file out, and they tried to keep them from leaving by saying the Horsemen would be coming out later in the show. For the Thunder on October 15th, they taped Van Hammer over Sick Boy, Conan over Parka, Finlay beating Riggs, Kidman keeping the Cruiserweight belt beating Kaz Hayashi, Chavo Jr. over Iaukea and main event was Malenko over Ray via DQ when NWO interfered and Horsemen saved. Goldberg, who played at Georgia, was on the ESPN pregame show before the Georgia vs. Tennessee football game. Major events scheduled for January are January 4th Nitro at Georgia Dome, which affects New Japan as with a major Nitro the same day WCW won't be able to send any of the big guns to New Japan's traditional big show of the year. Saturday night taping January 5th in Gainesville, Georgia. Thunder on January 7th in Richmond, Virginia. House show January 8th in Winston-Salem. Nitro January 11th in Knoxville. There is talk of honoring Brian Hildebrand at this show. Sold out pay-per-view January 17th in Charleston, West Virginia. Nitro January 18th in Columbus, Ohio at Schottenstein Center. Saturday Night TV on January 19th in Dayton. Thunder on January 21st in Indianapolis. Nitro on January 25th in Dallas. House show January 29th in San Diego. House show January 30th in Los Angeles at the Forum. House shows this past week saw Saturday night taping on October 6th in Gainesville, Georgia drew a sellout 1,502 paying $35,525. October 7th in Huntsville, Alabama drew 6,892 paying $126,555. October 9th in Dayton, Ohio drew a sellout 6,317 paying $110,223. October 10th in Columbus, Ohio drew a sellout 7,057 paying $159,770, and October 11th in Milwaukee drew 6,202 paying $155,028. For the week starting with October 5th in Columbia, South Carolina and ending on October 12th in Chicago, merchandise was $478,848 or $7.40 per head. House shows were all headlined by announced Goldberg vs. Giant, with Goldberg going over every night in short matches and Hart vs. Sting. To avoid doing the latter match, they do tags with Luger and Rick Steiner vs. Norton and Ray with a Hart run-in, followed by Sting, ending with a six-man tag with the faces going over when Ray gets racked by Luger. Huntsville instead had Conan and Page vs. Vincent and Ray as the tag and Hall vs. Nash as the single that doesn't take place and instead winds up as a six-man. Please don't ask why Wolfpack and WCW members team up when Wolfpack is supposed to be part of the NWO group that is trying to take over WCW. Political columnist James J. Kilpatrick did a column, believe it or not, on whether or not Mark Madden is a journalist in regards to his rights to protect sources in the WWF versus WCW lawsuit. Madden was originally allowed to protect his sources, claiming journalist shield laws when depositioned by the WWF in the case. The WWF appealed the ruling, claiming he wasn't a journalist, and won in appeal. Kilpatrick had no clue what he was writing about, unfortunately, as it is an interesting question, but he didn't get it. It didn't appear that U.S. Court of Appeals Judge Richard Nygaard that ruled against Madden being a journalist really got it either. Kilpatrick, who gained fame from being the right-wing pundit on 60 Minutes, thought that since pro wrestling isn't an honest sport, its affairs can't be classified as news. He thought the ruling against Madden is because pro wrestling is more melodrama and ballet than sport, which should have absolutely nothing to do with the issue at hand. From my perspective, knowing the situation better than most, Madden has been a journalist in the past. Some of what Madden does in his wrestling work is very much journalism. Some very much isn't. The overriding theme is humor and entertainment and not journalistic reporting, although he does that as part of his act. He plays the character, and it is a character, of a reporter, which he has been in the past and sometimes still is. In doing so, he does some real reporting and does gather a lot of information. Gene Okerlund makes up half the stuff on his hotline, but some of the news is real. To me, Okerlund isn't anywhere close to being a journalist, and I'm sure he wouldn't ever categorize himself as anything more than an entertainer, because he knowingly makes stuff up and does little to differentiate between made-up stuff and real stuff. But sometimes even what he does is only little baby steps away from what people in the mainstream media do. Witness much of the coverage of Lawler and Jim Carrey. Knowingly reporting storyline as real doesn't qualify. Kilpatrick quoted Nygaard ruling Madden isn't a journalist because he uncovered no story on his own. He relied solely on information fed to him by WCW executives. Unfortunately, Nygaard couldn't be more wrong in that statement. Nygaard wrote, individuals claiming the protection of the journalist privilege must demonstrate the concurrence of three elements. 1. They are engaged in investigative reporting. 2. Gather news. 3. They possess the intent at the inception of the news gathering process to disseminate this news to the public. But by those standards, Madden is a journalist. WCW is appealing that ruling. WWF better hope that either the next judge comes up with a better definition of a journalist, because Nygaard's definition isn't very good, or they can find another judge who just doesn't get it. Kilpatrick's conclusion is that if there is to be a shield or privilege law, there should be a sign on the courthouse door, "No flax need apply." By that definition, Madden, in his WCW role, has fallen on both sides at different times. How come they have a MasterCard for Lex Luger and not one for Ric Flair? Fox Sports did a feature on the San Diego Padres baseball team, and in their trophy case they have one of the old NWA six-man tag belts that the Road Warriors and Genichiro Tenryu held for such a long time before they were phased out. WWF Complete Judgment Day pay-per-view lineup for October 18th in Chicago is Undertaker vs. Kane for the title with Austin as referee, Ken Shamrock vs. Mankind for the IC title, The Rock vs. Mark Henry, New Age Outlaws defend tag titles against Headbangers, D'Lo Brown defends European title against X-Pac in what is expected to wind up as some sort of a stipulation match. Takumi Chinoku vs. Christian Cage for the light heavyweight title, LOD, with Droz as its new third member. versus DOA and Paul Ellering, Val Venus versus Goldust, and Mark Marrow versus Al Snow. This show, which is already sold out, marks the 9th consecutive major promotion show in Chicago that has sold out. In the main event, they are doing the storyline that if Austin doesn't count a pinfall, then McMahon will fire him, but that counting a pinfall giving someone else the title would be the ultimate in humiliation. Too bad they didn't clue Austin in on this storyline 2 weeks ago when he talked about having no problem counting the fall in the match. House show business is through the roof. This past week WWF sold out 4 of its 5 house show dates, and we're told talking arenas besides Nassau Coliseum like Pittsburgh and Cleveland for regular house shows. Raw on October 12th from the Nassau Coliseum was a pretty hot show before a sellout 10,632 paying $238,803. They started taping some matches for syndication with Farouk over Sean Stasiak, Headbangers over Hardy Boys, DOA beat Steve Corino and Julio Sanchez, Joe beat Brown in a non-title, Godfather beat Bradshaw, Kurgan and Golga over Too Much, and Gangrel beat Edge when Christian interfered. Raw opened with Outlaws defending the tag titles going to a no contest with LOD 2002-07. Drozdov came out in full LOD regalia with Animal. Hawk came out and sat at ringside and claimed he was having a problem with painkillers and he was trying to get back in shape and that he had no problem with Droz joining the team. Hawk said at this point he was an alternate on the team. Billy Gunn said he was in DX and they downplayed the problems, but he did a few facials to lead one to believe they haven't totally given up on the story. DOA and Ellering attacked Hawk and Animal and Droz saved him. While this was going on, the Headbangers hit the ring and broke a boombox over Road Dogg's head and he juiced. The original plan was for Southern Justice to win the tag titles, I believe last week on Raw, but it didn't happen due to Mark Canterbury's injury. There was a rare slip-up, the type of which you expect more from WCW, as on Canadian syndication they forget to edit out a segment where Doak Hendricks was talking about Southern Justice having won the tag title on Raw as was planned but never happened. They announced Triple H as stripped of the IC title due to the 30-day rule and had a one-night tournament on the show consisting of all the singles bouts. Shamrock beat Steve Blackman in 2:29 with a knee submission, with the gimmick being Blackman's knee still wasn't ready. Owen Hart, under a mask in his old blue blazer outfit with cape, hit the ring and attacked both guys. Those guys that write TV have lost their minds ever since they saw the movie. They showed videos of Goldust beating up on Razor Ramon and Roddy Piper. Venus beat Marrow in 2:15 with a fisherman suplex when Terry Runnels distracted Marrow as he was going to the top. Jacqueline attacked Runnels after. Michael Cole then interviewed Sable, praising her for her acting on Pacific Blue the night before and asking if she was going to give up the WWF to go to Hollywood. Geez. Sable's acting was terrible on that show. Sable said she was staying to get the women's title. I believe the plan is for a title change either on Raw or on the December 6th pay-per-view show from London, England, and then she attacked Jacqueline and they rolled around wearing skimpy tops on live TV with implants flying every which way. Mankind beat Henry in 3:18 with a claw. Mankind took his boot off, and his sock off and put the sock in his hand so it was Mr. Socko with the claw on. Chyna came to the ring to confront Henry about the lawsuit, but Henry walked away saying it was in the legal process. Austin showed up driving a cement truck into the building. X-Pac beat Jarrett in 3:04. Jarrett stopped the Bronco ride with a low blow as X-Pac dove onto him. Jarrett went for the guitar but X-Pac caught him from behind with a schoolboy. Austin then destroyed McMahon's Corvette by pouring cement in it until the window exploded while McMahon totally overacted. Still, it made for good TV. At least that's what I thought when I saw the same thing on Nitro last week. Austin went to the ring for an interview and McMahon came out in a wheelchair. The McMahon-Austin hatred was coming dangerously close to becoming a parody due to McMahon's overacting. He was talking about how due to his injury he'll never play polo again, like anyone believes he ever did in the first place. Vince said he had balls the size of grapefruits and Austin called him an asshole. Shamrock beat Venus with the ankle lock in 4:32. They beat the hell out of each other. Goldust showed up after the match and kicked a heavily selling Venus in the Venus. The interview that didn't air the previous night on Heat was redone, with Rock, D-Lo and Henry teasing dissension in the nation. X-Pac beat Mankind in 3:15 with a schoolboy after Shamrock hit Mankind in the ankle with a chair. Shamrock then put the Sankakujin, basically a triangle with an armbar, on X-Pac for a long time. They were going to award the title to Shamrock on a forfeit, but X-Pac insisted they do a match and screamed ring the bell. I cleaned it up since they didn't bleep it. The two had a good match ending when Shamrock used the ankle lock submission in 3:54 to win the title. X-Pac had a bloody nose. Both X-Pac and Shamrock came off really good throughout the tournament with both good and hard work. Shamrock is making an even better heel than I thought he would. They'll probably do some sort of angle when Triple H is to present Shamrock the belt at the pay-per-view. Finally, Austin and Rock beat Undertaker and Kane via DQ when Big Boss Man, Ray Traylor, came out wearing a mask and attacked Austin, and then unmasked. It was a good main event match. Paul Bearer returned, although it was never clear what his next move is going to be. Undertaker put the knee lock on Austin as the show went off the air. After the show went off, Boss Man attacked Austin with a stick again. When he left, Patterson and Briscoe put the boots to him. Of course, he made his comeback and gave both stunners. Rock gave both Briscoe and Patterson a double people's elbow. Austin went after McMahon, but Slaughter got in the way and got stunned. He then tipped McMahon's wheelchair over backwards and McMahon took a spill. According to Jerry Lawler, there is virtually no chance Jim Carrey is going to appear on WWF television or do pay-per-view appearances. Lawler, who is claiming everywhere to have not been in on the Carrey angle, although he believes it was an angle and that Carrey wasn't really hurt, and he believes Carrey was looking for an excuse to wear a neck brace in public and fool people into thinking a fake injury was real like Kaufman did after his confrontation with Lawler 16 years ago, said there is a huge difference between Carrey and Andy Kaufman. Kaufman was a lifelong wrestling fan who wanted badly to be part of the business. He approached Vince McMahon Sr. in 1981 with the idea of the angle, but McMahon Sr. didn't want anything to do with him. Bill Apter found out about the conversation and steered Kaufman to Memphis, and Lawler and the rest is history. He noted that even after Kaufman found out he had cancer, although he publicly kept it quiet, he continued to work Memphis wrestling and he never cashed a check for appearing on those shows, although he came so often that by the end the crowds were sick of seeing him, as if you'll notice in the Comedy Channel series on The Feud that the latter shows had weak crowds. Even the first meeting that was so heavily publicized and drew 8,000 fans, while a good crowd, was no better than Memphis would do at the time for one of its bigger shows. Lawler said that Carrey is not a wrestling fan. He claimed that Kevin Dunn and Vince McMahon wanted him to address the Carrey situation on Raw since it was such a big story, but that the producers of the movie didn't want him talking about it. Dunn said to just say that he'd talk about it to Carrey's face if Carrey came on Raw, trying to build curiosity to the idea Carrey would appear on WWF television as a way to address the situation, but not say anything about it. Although Carrey's people claim Lawler's role, which in the script is pretty significant, would be taken out of the movie and that Carrey would never work with him again, obviously that isn't happening. Jim Ross was flown back to Hollywood this past week to do voiceover work on the wrestling segments. Time magazine ran a brief item on the angle which treated the Kaufman injury as if it was real but did question whether the Carrey thing was real, saying that the actor's rep denies it was a publicity stunt. But in the artificial world of Hollywood and pro wrestling, one never knows. Entertainment Weekly, like Newsweek, treated both the Carrey incident and Kaufman injuries as being real assaults by Lawler, although elsewhere in EU in the hot sheet, it listed the incident as the single hottest topic of the week, asking the question, where do you go when injured by a pro wrestler? To a fake hospital with fake doctors. I hope nobody files a lawsuit against those magazines and tries to get the reporters to reveal their sources. Vader is telling people his WWF release doesn't have in it a non-compete clause to where he can't go to WCW. Vader worked all the house shows this past week, putting Rock over. It is said that Austin sells more t-shirts than any entertainer or sports figure in the world. I went out to the local amusement park on October 11th, a Sunday with no pay-per-view, can you believe that? And keep in mind the location, but in order, it was Austin t-shirts, exclusively on younger boys, followed by Michael Jordan jerseys, teenage boys only, Steve Young jerseys, teenagers and a lot of adults, Jerry Rice jerseys, teenagers, local martial arts star Kung La t-shirts, early 20s Oriental guys, and exactly one NWO shirt. The December 13th pay-per-view show from Vancouver is being labeled Rock Bottom, so that should get everyone speculating on Rock taking the title at Survivor Series. 22 members of the Pittsburgh Steelers attended the October 9th WWF show. Rock and Henry went to the Steelers practice earlier that day. Henry's cousin Kevin Henry plays for the Steelers. They wound up losing 2 days later to the Bengals. The New Yorker magazine will be doing a cover story shortly on McMahon. Austin hosted the Good Morning New York TV show on October 13th. Austin also suffered a 6-stitch cut working Hershey on October 11th. WWF is really pushing to get Rock as the centerpiece for new mainstream pub, including trying to get him on episodes of The Net and Silk Stockings on USA. Jim Cornette's reference to a cat named Renfield on Sunday Night Heat was meant as an inside buzz to Brian Hildebrand, who briefly in SMW played Daryl Van Horn's sidekick Renfield. Chyna will be undergoing plastic surgery to change her face, her jaw in particular, as they want to give her a more feminine look. House shows this week were October 8th in State College, Pennsylvania drew $6,925 and $127,906 on a show without Undertaker or Austin. October 9th in Pittsburgh drew a sellout $15,784 paying $285,182. October 10th in Cleveland drew a sellout $16,4983 paying $298,162. And October 11th in Hershey drew a sellout $8,555 paying $177,957. Merchandise for the week was $404,583 or $6.86 per head. Rock over Vader and Kane over Mankind headlined State College. The other cities headlined with a four-way with Sergeant Slaughter as ref, and you know by now how that one plays out. The only new angle was Shamrock and Blackman versus Godfather and Henry in underneath tag matches, which has Shamrock walking out on his partner, who ends up getting pinned. Pay-per-view dates for the first 6 months of 1997 are January 24th Rumble, February 14th, March 28th Mania, April 25th, May 23rd, June 27th King of the Ring, and July 25th. The wrestler Rob Da Silva, who worked on a WWF syndication match, is Toronto wrestler Rob Echeverria, who trained alongside both Johnny Swinger of WCW and Edge. The Reader's Pages. NWA/ECW. Before I'm lambasted by those at ECW, I want to make a couple of corrections to your news item regarding the ECW angle. There was apparently some confusion in our recent conversation. Earlier this year, I posed several online challenges to Paul Heyman and ECW to send a representative, preferably Shane Douglas, to wrestle Dan Severn at our 50th anniversary show, so he could bend whoever it was that they sent into a pretzel. I did so for several reasons. 1, because I knew ECW would probably never respond. 2, if they did, I thought a Severn versus Douglas contest would draw since the show is near their home base and people would be curious as to whether it would be a work or not. 3, because ECW began re-airing the angle where Douglas trashed the NWA title belt, which really pissed me off. While the challenge started out as a shoot, I began thinking that if I turned up the steam online, I could force Heyman into doing an angle, as ECW is very in tune with the internet community. You have to also bear in mind that this idea was coming about at a time when the WWF was pretty much phasing the NWA name off its television, so I was looking for a hook for the organization. I made some inquiries and eventually spoke to Taz. However, nowhere in our conversations did it come up that Dan was going to put Shane over. First off, I don't think he would. Second, either I nor anyone else on our board would want the strap on Shane. We did talk about a deal with a Dan-Taz feud, with one idea being that Taz would take the title with a controversial finish and then dropping it back 3 months later in a similar fashion. He'd feud with Shane in between those two matches, which would set up the title versus title pay-per-view match. Bear in mind that even though I was negotiating, I would still have to get 3/5 board approval to make it happen. It didn't matter anyway. From what I was told, Heyman didn't want to do it the way I suggested because he didn't want to commit to something that had a provision built in like that. So when we couldn't agree, we both decided to leave it as is and walk away with the door open. It should be noted that nowhere along the line was the FTW title going to be either trashed or replaced, but rather it would be just another title that Taz would have. That was really it until I got a call a few weeks later from Taz, who said that Heyman had an idea for me and another representative of the NWA, who could be anyone but Dennis Corraluzzo, to come to the ECW arena and award Taz with a new FTW belt. Basically, the angle would be that we, the NWA, recognized Taz because he represents a more traditional style of wrestling, and we could relate to a champion not recognized by a group, since Severn at the time wasn't being recognized as NWA champion by the WWF. When I asked what benefit we would get out of it, the answer was exposure on their TV show. I didn't like it, so I begged off the idea. That's when the suggestion came regarding stripping Dan of the title and giving it to Taz. Again, I asked, what was the benefit? The answer was the same, so again I begged off. I felt in order to make anything work with ECW, there had to be some kind of reciprocal return for our organization, and also we would never think of stripping Dan of the title unless he gave us just cause. And in the case of Dan, there is none. Here's a guy who went to bat for us when the NWA angle in the WWF was dead and convinced them to allow him to wear the NWA belt to the ring again. He's a stand-up guy that has done nothing but right by our organization. When the local promoters ask for him and he's available, he goes all across North America and works. He's not full of himself. Everyone who has ever worked with Dan will say that he's 100% business and is a pleasure to deal with. It's true. While it was initially my idea to try and work an angle with ECW, I only wanted to do it if it made sense for both organizations, not just theirs. I didn't see it as such, and that's how it ended. Howard Brody, NWA President, Tampa, Florida. Tanner, I read your notes about Pancrase. I got the impression you think Evan Tanner has never lost. He has one loss last year to 19-year-old 280-pound Heath Herring, who is also from Amarillo and who I also got started. Heath was extremely lucky, but nonetheless it did happen. Tanner was offered the match with Vitor Belfort after Jerry Bullender was injured. We discussed it and turned it down. 2 weeks was not enough time for him to get ready. I believe Heath will be fighting Tank Abbott at a Super Brawl show. I know Heath real well, and Abbott better not underestimate him. Steve Nelson, Amarillo, Texas. Page. Although it has not been mentioned as much lately, for a while a whole lot of people were acting like Diamond Dallas Page was the most improved wrestler over the past few years. While he is apparently dedicated to wrestling and certainly loyal to his employer, and in the last year, reaping from that loyalty, I disagree. DDP is a slightly above average worker. He can be carried to a good match but can't carry someone else to a good match. I think this would be evident if he's booked in a program with a poor worker. He works hard, but any improvement is due to who he is working with and the added push which allows his matches to have more creative booking because they are higher on the card, and generally speaking, the higher on the card you are, the more shortcuts you're allowed to take. I think Triple H and Rocky Maivia have given us some great work over the past few months. Triple H likely would have some similar comparisons to DDP as above to justify his improvement. Maivia, on the other hand, has been given a break from day one. But in the last few months, he has had great matches with Triple H on 2 pay-per-view shows. The incredible thing is they went 30 minutes and 26 minutes. When was the last time you saw DDP work a great long match like that? Going that long didn't really expose either guy. It takes a great 90s style worker to go 30 minutes and have a very good match. At the Edmonton House show, Rocky worked with Jesse Jam for only the second time ever in a singles match. They had the best match on the show, in the 3 stars range. JJ is a great talker but an average worker, although he'd be great in a territory. Jim Ross would always call Rocky a blue chipper, but his stock has risen considerably. I was at the Hearts training camp in Calgary a few weeks back. There are a couple of CFL players who met Dwayne Johnson when he tried out for the Calgary Stampeders. Part of their motivation to get into wrestling was they thought if Dwayne could do it, so could they. I think Dwayne is better than he gets credit for being. I was at the Calgary Stampede pay-per-view and it likely had the best sustained heat of any pay-per-view in recent memory. The work in the ring was incredibly solid with the Hart Foundation against a ragtag team of babyfaces, who were heels in Canada for this night. It was also the least hyped pay-per-view show of 1997. But it was the greatest night in the history of wrestling in Alberta, not because it was the first pay-per-view show ever from Alberta, or drew a big gate, but because of the emotion involved. I grew up watching Brett and Davey in the early 80s and Owen, Brian Pillman and Chris Benoit in the late 80s. In the ring that night were 4 of the 5 wrestlers that built Alberta wrestling. Wrestling has been in Alberta for 40 plus years, but it was the legacy of the 1980s that everyone remembers. Hiroshi Hase, Shinya Hashimoto, Jushin Liger, Dynamite Kid, Johnny Smith all were from Alberta in this time period. It would suggest that there were more wrestlers who were inspired to get into the business by Dynamite Kid than any other wrestler in the 80s. The pop when Pillman first came out was deafening. He hadn't worked regularly in Alberta in 8 or 9 years. I've seen Stanley Cup championship winning games and NBA 7th games of the finals, and I've never heard a crowd like I did that night. My eyes watered when Pillman came out. I was so proud that I'd seen this guy from the start of his career. When Owen and finally Brett came out, tears were running down my cheeks. I was embarrassed and proud at the same time. It was the greatest day in the history of Stampede Wrestling. I reminisce about this because of watching the Horseman interview on Nitro. I hate to say it, but the crowd reaction was even bigger and the emotion involved was far greater. The Horseman represented to the fans dedication, commitment, high work rate, earning your position at a time when dedication and professionalism are regularly being short-circuited. My eyes watered both nights because I truly honor the dedication of people like Pillman, Owen Hart, Bret Hart, Arn Anderson, Ric Flair, Dean Malenko, and the classiest person I've met in this business, Chris Benoit. To me, Benoit is the only reason why I order WCW pay-per-view events. He's the melting pot of the legacy of 1980s Alberta wrestling, and of the 4 Horsemen. Nobody respects the wrestling business more than Benoit. No old-timer. No second-generation wrestler. He is the real total package. Wrestlers are getting into the business today because of Chris the same way they did 10 years ago because of Dynamite Kid. Trent Walters. Edmonton, Alberta. Best matches. I found the letter concerning the best matches in the August 3rd issue interesting. I believe the greatest AAA matches I ever saw were Mascarada Sagrada vs. Espectrito on March 12, 1994 in Los Angeles, Love Machine and Eddie Guerrero vs. El Hijo del Santo and Octagon from the When Worlds Collide pay-per-view in the match for the AAA Tag Team titles in 1993. I saw many other 4-star matches over the years, but those mentioned were the 3 best that stand the test of time. There are many AAA matches that had more innovative moves, but those mentioned matches delivered a decent story. The greatest ECW matches I ever saw mostly came between 1993 to 1995. Granted, the style presents more innovative and dangerous moves today, but the matches left a long-lasting impression on me. Some of these matches might be nothing but footnotes in a few years. I thought the Headhunters vs. Crash the Terminator, Hugh Morris, and Miguel Perez match from Ultra Clash in 1993 was an awesome match at the time, but that match would probably be only a 2-star match by today's standards. I still think the Sabu/Shane Douglas/Terry Funk Night the Line Was Crossed was one of the best ECW matches in history. I enjoyed the Pitbulls vs. Raven and Stevie Richards 2 of 3 Fall match from 1995. The swerves and run-ins made this a very interesting match. But how many matches today have a million run-ins and swerves? By today's standards this would probably be just an ordinary match, and it didn't leave a lasting impression on too many people. The Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Juventud Guerrera 2 of 3 Fall match from Philadelphia is a match that stands the test of time. The Michinoku Pro 6-man tag from the Barely Legal pay-per-view was awesome by US standards, but in Japan, it was just a typical Michinoku Pro 6-man tag team main event. This match may stand the test of time in the US since most fans haven't seen Michinoku Pro on a regular basis. The main event on the Barely Legal pay-per-view with Terry Funk winning the ECW title was one of those rare matches that got the emotion of everyone. I recall seeing many US independent matches that were innovative for their time, but most of these matches have been forgotten over the years. I still watch these matches on occasion and still think they would be great matches today. But many people have either forgotten them or never saw them. Nobody talks about the Eddie Gilbert vs. Cactus Jack matches anymore. The 2 out of 3 match in 1991 was a classic in its day. It featured brawling, insane bumps, and a glass bottle. The Terry Funk vs. Eddie Gilbert Texas Death Match from a 1992 WWA show was one of the best matches I've seen. Very few people remember this match 6 years later. Sabu vs. Lightning Kid from NWA Grand Slam 1993 was innovative for its time since the moves were unique to US rings. But today there are many recent Sabu matches that have had more innovative moves that suck. Terry Funk vs. Sabu from the WWN TV tapings in 1994 was awesome. Everyone who saw it live gave it good reviews, but very few people ever saw a bootlegged copy of the match. I can recall many more matches like these. It's not always the standards that prohibit matches from becoming well-known classics. It's usually the exposure that the matches get. Most of the matches mentioned have to be seen through tape trading. I know many people can name a million 4-star matches from All Japan and New Japan. But I can recall many 4-star FMW and IWA Japan matches that would definitely not be 4 stars if they were done today, since when looked at years later they come across as nothing but sick spectacles. There are a lot of matches that I thought were easily 4 stars in the past. When I look at them years later, they usually come across as being good, but less spectacular than at the time, since matches are becoming more innovative at a very rapid pace. That doesn't necessarily mean today's matches are better, it just shows how wrestling is becoming more difficult and innovative in recent years. Wrestling standards and styles have changed rapidly with the introduction of Lucha Libre to the US. Aerial moves are constantly evolving and meaning less than in previous years in almost every wrestling style. ECW is also an important factor in the current style, since brawling has to be more violent or it just looks redundant and passé. The actual psychology and the story delivered in the ring still creates the most spectacular matches. This case is proven in several War Games matches in 1991 and 1992, the tag team match in When Worlds Collide, and especially in the Bret Hart vs. Steve Austin WrestleMania match. Eric Bimbin. Brooklyn, New York. Is WCW a bad joke or what? Who books this shit? For a company that everyone raves about their talent roster, what good is it if the talent is being misused? The difference between WCW and WWF is that if D'Lo Brown was in WCW, he'd be jobbing for Jim Duggan or Bryan Adams every Monday and Thursday. In WWF, he's becoming a respected mid-card performer with a belt. WCW has one of the best talents in the business in Chris Benoit, and he can't even buy a pay-per-view win because he's involved with you-know-who's ex. Sure, there are politics in the WWF and in every other promotion in the world, but there is more of a shot at upward mobility in the WWF, especially if you have any kind of talent and a decent personality to work with. Guys like Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, Juventud Guerrera, and several others are held back in WCW. I hear Eric Bischoff is threatening some of the guys to sign extensions of their contract or they won't be pushed. I didn't know they were being pushed in the first place. We all know the Bret Hart deal. But it's still amazing to see how far his star has fallen. They could have the next big thing in wrestling in Goldberg as the most charismatic and hottest box office star, but what have they done since they put the belt on him? They phased his TV time down because Hogan and Bischoff need to get their rocks off 10 or 11 times per show. I agree with your assessment that it was too soon for Goldberg to do his first promo, even though he did a good job with his first major promo. The July 27th and August 3rd Nitros were so bad it was pathetic. The way business is today, how do they keep repeating the same mistakes? The only thing that saved both shows from being totally unwatchable was Chris Jericho's matches with Dean Malenko and Rey Mysterio Jr. and his antics with Joe Dillon. Seeing 45 to 50-year-old men on an ego trip isn't my idea of entertainment. How much input does Dusty Rhodes really have these days? Some of the shows are eerily similar to 1987 to 1988 NWA TV, except that Hogan is in the Dusty spot. As far as WWF goes, Raw has been the hottest show since 1995 to 1996 ECW, although for different reasons. It's been an amazing year for the WWF considering Hart made the switch and one of the greatest talents the business has ever seen, Shawn Michaels, has been out with a back injury. Thank God for Steve Austin. Maybe Sonny could go to WCW and manage Scott Hall. They could use one more ego to deal with, but Tammy is only 25 instead of 45. As far as Chef Anton's letter in the August 3rd Observer regarding greatest matches, I agree with most of them. I've come up with a few more to add to the list. Michaels vs. Undertaker Hell in the Cell and Michaels and Diesel vs. 1-2-3 Kid and Razor Ramon TV match from November 1994, which was one of the best television matches of the past 10 years. Isn't it weird that none of the Michaels vs. Bret Hart matches make the list? Most notably the Iron Man match from WrestleMania 12. It had tremendous hype going in and it was a great match, but it wasn't a 5 stars match either and was missing something. For WCW, Midnight Express vs. Southern Boys from the 1990 Bash, Midnight Express vs. Fantastics from 1988 Chattanooga TV taping where Fantastics won the U.S. Tag Team titles, Jushin Liger vs. Brian Pillman from Super Brawl 2, Lex Luger vs. Ricky Steamboat from both Philadelphia and Baltimore in 1989 on consecutive nights. Actually, the entire Baltimore Bash of 1989 was just incredible and remains in my mind the single greatest pay-per-view show in history. Vader vs. Cactus Jack from TBS in 1993 from The Brutality, Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Psychosis from the 1996 Bash. For ECW, Eddie Guerrero vs. Too Cold Scorpio on Guerrero's first night in when he won the TV title, Benoit vs. Dean Malenko any of their matches, and Chris Jericho vs. Pitbull No. 2 vs. Scorpio 3-way for the TV title. Chris Poulos. Lansdowne, Pennsylvania. I'm assuming that every match that has won the Match of the Year award was given 5 stars. If that assumption is wrong, let me know. Which match was voted 1997 Match of the Year? My pick was Mitsuharu Misawa's title win over Kenta Kobashi in January. All Japan usually is perceived as boring to fans who have only seen WWF, WCW and ECW. It took me a while to understand the style and appreciate it, but now I'm a big fan of the company and Misawa in particular. Your comments on Akira Taue in the March 16th issue when discussing future Hall of Famers were right on. He's not nearly as talented as Misawa, Kobashi, Toshiaki Kawada or Jun Akiyama. The only part of All Japan first-time viewers pop for are the bumps on the head and neck from the suplexes. If there was a winner for the most unimproved promotion in 1998, WCW would be the runaway winner. 1997 was probably the most consistently entertaining year for WCW of this decade. Everything has gone downhill this year. Guys like Ultimo Dragon, Chris Benoit, Dean Malenko and Rey Mysterio Jr. were getting great crowd reactions, but they were kept as mid-cards and all are less over now than they were a year ago thanks to jobbing for guys like Bryan Adams, Meng, Kurt Hennig, etc. that nobody gives a damn about. Eddie Guerrero was doing a great job as a heel and getting serious heat, but that was all screwed up due to that poorly booked feud with Chavo Jr. and his losing streak gimmick. Is there a rule in WCW that all the headliners have to be lousy workers? I suppose so, since everyone from Hogan to Nash to Goldberg to Sting to Luger to Piper to Savage would be out of luck if they were forced to have a match with each other above 2 stars. DDP isn't good enough to carry any of them to great matches. Bret Hart is stuck in the middle since no talented wrestlers are allowed to work main events. Robert Gray. Benton, Illinois. Response from Dave Meltzer. Last year's match of the year was the Bret Hart vs. Steve Austin WrestleMania match. Misawa vs. Kobashi took second, but it was my pick for first as well, although I feel any of the top 7 matches in last year's poll: Undertaker vs. Michaels, Hell in the Cell, Guerrero vs. Mysterio Jr. with Mask at Stake, Misawa vs. Kawada, Samurai vs. Kanemoto Jr. Tournament Final, and Misawa and Akiyama vs. Kawada and Taue Tag Tourney Final, could have won without much controversy. If you look back, probably every winner of Match of the Year should have been given 5 stars, although not all were by me since we all make mistakes. I think I gave the 1992 winner, Crawford and Furnace vs. Kobashi and Kikuchi, 4 3/4 stars, but I must have been wrong since so many voted it as the best match of that year and some saw it as the greatest tag match of all time up to that point. I gave Steiners vs. Hase and Sasaki, the 1991 winner, 4.5 stars and saw that one live and it won as best match, and I still today wouldn't rate it as any higher than that. I gave Savage vs. Steamboat in 1987 either 4.5 stars or 4 3/4 stars, but since that match became so legendary I must have been wrong. I wouldn't have given either the 1983 winner of Flair vs. Race or the 1980 Backlund vs. Patera match a 5 stars rating, but star ratings were barely around in those days. Hase and Sasaki, the 1991 winner, 4.5 stars and saw that one live and it won as best match, and I still today wouldn't rate it as any higher than that. I gave Savage vs. Steamboat in 1987 either 4.5 stars or 4 3/4 stars, but since that match became so legendary I must have been wrong. I wouldn't have given either the 1983 winner of Flair vs. Race or the 1980 Backlund vs. Patera match a 5 stars rating, but star ratings were barely around in those days.